that I understand there are still some who may believe otherwise, but in my view, there's an increasingly widespread consensus that our communications laws and policies need updating in light of the dramatic, transformative, technological, and competitive marketplace changes that have occurred since the passage of the 1996 Telecommunications Act. I'm optimistic that we'll get the telecom reform job accomplished one day, maybe even sooner than many people think. I was pleased when the House Commerce Committee initiated its process to re-examine and update the Communications Act. And Free State Foundation scholars have been active participants in that process. We've already submitted 3 very substantial and very substantive white paper responses. And we'll continue advocating free market-oriented communications policy reform, whether at the FCC, on the Hill, or elsewhere. So, right before introducing Senator Thune, I just want to tell you what's going to happen today. After Senator Thune's address this morning, we're delighted that we're going to get the view from the FCC, from Commissioner Ajit Pai. And then following Commissioner Pai's remarks, we're going to have a panel discussion with 3 experts, whom many of you know, John Bergmayer, Scott Cleland, and Adam Thierer. And I'll introduce all of them in turn. So now, it's my pleasure to formally introduce Senator Thune. I have to say, he's got a very long and very impressive, it's as impressive as it is long resume. And with his permission, I'm not going to do all of it here, but we've got a link to it on our website. Of course, it's on the Senator's website. So I'm just going to hit some highlights. And I guess most importantly, probably for our purposes here this morning, Senator Thune is the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. But he also serves on the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee, as well as the Finance Committee. So they're all very important positions. Senator Thune now serves as chairman of the Senate Republican Conference, the number 3 position in the Senate Republican leadership. In 1996, he won the first of 3 House terms that he served. And again, I'm skipping over even some of this, which to me is all fascinating. But he won his current Senate seat in 2004 when he made history by defeating a U.S. Senate party leader for the first time in 52 years. I wonder how many of you remember who that is. We're not going to have quizzes, but I think that's interesting. And also for you history buffs, I found this fascinating. He was only the 3rd, so in 2010, Senator Thune ran unopposed, and he was only the 3rd Republican and the only South Dakotan to run unopposed for the U.S. Senate since the direct election of senators back in 1913. God, over 100 years ago. Really impressive. Senator Thune received his undergraduate degree from Holy University, and he's got an MBA from the University of South Dakota. So with that, please join me in welcoming Senator Thune.
Thank you, Randy, and welcome. It's great to be with you all this morning. It's not often I get to be the opening act for Ajit Pai. So I'm going to try and warm you guys up for it. I'm sure it'll be a lot more interesting. But I want to, Randy, thank you and what the Free State Foundation does just in terms of the great work promoting free market policies, economic liberty when it comes to communications and technology industries in this country, and the very insightful papers that you publish, the conferences like this one that you host are incredibly important to the public debate on these issues. And I'm just glad I have the opportunity to be able to join you today and share a few of my thoughts on what we ought to be doing to advance our country's digital economy. Before policymakers can talk about which communications laws need to be updated, and you referenced that in your opening remarks, and which regulations have outlived their purpose, we first need to understand where the United States stands with respect to its communications and technology capabilities. We often hear about how the U.S. is falling behind the rest of the world, how our broadband infrastructure is mediocre, and how our communications industries are not competitive. These claims are so often repeated by pundits and advocates and even comedians that they almost become self-evident. But the question is, are the claims actually true? The answer is no. For instance, the Free State Foundation's own Christopher Yu recently published a paper comparing the United States and Europe in many broadband metrics. Professor Yu found that the United States fared better in broadband investment, network latency, delivering advertised broadband speeds, and overall broadband usage. But where the U.S. really outshines Europe is broadband deployment. 82% of American households now have access to a high-speed broadband connection of at least 25 megabits, compared to just 54% in Europe. And when it comes to mobile broadband, the gap is even more pronounced. 27% of Europe is covered by 4G LTE services, compared to an extraordinarily high 86% here in the United States. Our lead in these metrics is all the more impressive when you take into consideration that America is geographically much larger and more rural than Europe. And I can add, some personal experience to this. I grew up in a town in South Dakota of 500 people out in the middle of the state. My father, who's 94 years old, still lives there, lives in the little house that I grew up in. When I grew up, my life began and ended at the city limits of Murdo. That was kind of the boundaries of what you knew and experienced. But my dad at 94 today is connected to the world. He is constantly forwarding me emails and texts and things that he gets from other people, and can sit there with a wireless network on his laptop at 94 years old in my hometown of 500 people in the middle of South Dakota and literally access the world. And that's what's really remarkable about what we have in this country. Now, we've got a lot of pro-regulatory advocates who claim our communications sector is dominated by monopolies and duopolies, but the evidence in the marketplace doesn't support that view either. Monopoly markets are typically characterized by a lack of investment, a lack of innovation, no new entrants, and excessive profits. Since 1996, the private sector has invested about $1.2 trillion into building and constantly upgrading our nation's communications networks, including about $60 billion annually in capital investments over the last few years. Regarding market entry, we've already seen rampant intermodal competition in the telephone and video markets, not to mention efforts by companies like Google and Dish Network who are committed to becoming serious new broadband players. As for excessive profits for communications providers, again, there's little evidence. Former Cleland administration official Everett Ehrlich found that Fortune 500 companies, broadband companies, had an average profit margin of just 3.7%. The average profit margin for Fortune 500 internet companies who offer services on top of the broadband infrastructure, a whopping 24%. As Ehrlich points out, this sizable difference makes clear that providers of broadband connectivity are not extracting undue profits from broadband users. So why does all this matter? Well, because painting a picture of a dysfunctional communications and broadband marketplace is central to the efforts of pro-regulatory advocates who claim more government intervention into the online world is needed to fix a quote-unquote broken system. Many of those who seek to regulate the internet are using mistruths and hyperbole to scare both the public and policymakers into restricting economic and individual liberty. We should instead be celebrating the accomplishments of our communications, technology, and internet industries and looking for ways to build upon this and drive further economic growth. The foundation that all of this success rests upon is our communications infrastructure, particularly our broadband networks. Without robust and ubiquitous broadband, many of these innovations and business breakthroughs of the last several years would not be possible. We must ensure that our communications policy reflects the new internet-powered world so that the potential of what rides over the top of our communications networks is fully realized. The last time Congress significantly updated our communications laws was in 1996. Back then, you had to pay for the internet by the hour, and going online meant tying up your home phone line. There were only 100,000 websites in 1996, and Google and Wikipedia had not even been created yet. Today, there are nearly 900 million websites. The Bipartisan and Deregulatory Telecommunications Act of 1996 encouraged intermodal competition and provided a light regulatory touch for information services. Bipartisan leadership at the FCC reinforced the light touch for the internet when implementing the law. All of this fostered an era of convergence and innovation in the communications space. Cable companies started to compete with telcos. Telcos got into the cable TV business, and everyone started offering internet access. The Telecom Act was far from perfect, but it got the job done. Even so, it is best to view the Telecom Act as a transitional law for a transitional time, rather than as a permanent statute that will last 62 years without major revision like its predecessor, the Communications Act of 1934. The original Communications Act was designed for an era of actual communications monopolies. The Telecom Act was designed for the transitional era that took us from monopoly to competition. And now we need a new policy framework for today's converged, competitive, and internet-powered world. This, of course, is much easier said than done. Modernizing the laws governing the communications and technology sectors is no small task, which is why I'm glad that my colleagues in the House of Representatives have already begun examining the regulation of the communications industry. It took several years for Congress to complete the Telecom Act back in the 1990s. Because of this, some people may think the Communications Act update is an impossible task in today's political environment and that Congress shouldn't even bother to try. I reject that pessimistic view. The voters didn't send us to Washington, D.C. to sit on our hands and resign ourselves to failure. They sent us here to make a difference. There's long been bipartisan consensus that our communications laws are outdated. According to my former colleague, Senator John Thune, the Telecom Act was obsolete within 6 months of enactment because it didn't take the internet into account. It would be a dereliction of duty if Congress did not at least explore whether and how our communications regulations can be modernized. I hope next year the Senate will follow the example set by the House to begin consideration of what a Communications Act update might look like. And any such discussion needs to begin with broadband internet and the government's regulatory posture toward it. It's been said before by me and many others, but it bears repeating until people really understand. Title II, Common Carrier Regulations, designed nearly a century ago for a telephone monopoly, simply do not make sense in a more competitive broadband world. Now, I'm not saying that the internet should be a lawless frontier free from any government oversight. That is the sort of straw man accusation leveled by those who want to avoid doing the hard work of justifying regulations for the internet ecosystem. Even so, policymakers must be careful to preserve the light touch regime first implemented by the Clinton administration that has been so successful in making us the digital envy of the world. Some people, however, want to completely upset that regime and instead want to see the internet shackled with Title II of the Communications Act. Title II is certainly not a light touch, and it certainly, with its burdensome rate regulation, property valuation, discontinuance provisions, along with many others, does not represent the light touch to which I'm referring. Traditional wireline telephony now makes up just 22% of the 443 million phone lines in America, and that rate continues to decline each year. When consumers are rapidly abandoning traditional Title II services, it makes little sense to apply Title II regulations to today's new technologies and business models. Even Google seems keen on avoiding the morass of Title II. The internet giant has specifically chosen not to offer telephone services with its Google Fiber broadband product because it wants to avoid the regulatory burdens that come along with it. Another reason I oppose Title II reclassification is because regulating an industry as if it were a public utility monopoly is the surest way to guarantee the industry will become a monopoly. As I discussed earlier, the evidence in the marketplace makes it clear that our broadband market is dynamic and competitive, not at all like the early days of Ma Bell that Title II was intended for. Public utility regulation, traditionally, is intended to do two things: protect the public from the harms of the monopoly, while simultaneously protecting the monopoly. Since the broadband market is demonstrably not a monopoly, regulating it as a public utility would only make the industry less competitive and less innovative. Or in other words, make it more like a monopoly. Neither Title II nor Section 706 of the Telecom Act are appropriate tools to regulate the internet. The former is outdated and politically corrosive. The latter is legally untested and potentially far too broad. When Congress wrote both provisions, it never expected or intended for either to apply to a dynamic and competitive broadband marketplace. Because of this, any internet regulations issued by the FCC based on either statute will be tied up in courts for years, thus creating more uncertainty for businesses and end users, not less. The only way to provide the certainty that ISPs, edge providers, content publishers, and end users need and want is for Congress to legislate. My colleagues and I need to roll up our sleeves and figure out how best to promote an open, competitive, and free internet. Doing so isn't going to be easy. It certainly would require every stakeholder to make some compromises. For the sake of the internet and America's economic competitiveness, I'm willing to try. I'd note that the last time Congress updated the Communications Act, a South Dakotan and a Michigander also sat atop the Commerce Committee, so perhaps the stars are aligning there too. For all the attention that Title II, Section 706, and the IP transition get, we cannot lose sight of mobile communications. Everywhere you look, from the forecasts of venture capitalists and industry analysts to that shiny device that teenagers use, it is all about mobile broadband. Some people are going to argue that mobile broadband isn't quote-unquote real broadband, that mobile isn't an alternative to fixed. But tell that to the owners of the 188 million smartphones in this country. People aren't using the internet stuck in one place, tethered to a single fixed broadband connection. In fact, Americans now spend more time with their mobile devices each day than they do going online with a laptop or a PC. If consumers view mobile and fixed broadband as part of the same seamless internet experience, why should policymakers act as if mobile and fixed broadband are completely separate, distinct things? We should take our guidance from what real people are actually doing in the marketplace rather than listening to ivory tower academics or professional advocates who claim that wireless internet access is quote-unquote second class. These are the very same people who argued that even a decade ago that wireless phones would never be an adequate substitute for landlines. Today, nearly half of Americans have proved those predictions to be short-sighted. For consumers, broadband is both fixed and mobile, both wired and wireless. Just as treating broadband like a monopoly is the surest way to get a broadband monopoly, treating mobile as an inferior form of broadband is the surest way to stifle wireless broadband. Rather than fighting the wisdom of the crowds, we should embrace it and pursue policies that make the mobile internet experience even more powerful and robust. One of the things Congress can and must do is to continue focusing on spectrum. Mobility drives the innovation economy, and spectrum is what fuels wireless services. Without enough spectrum, the private sector will not be able to keep pace with consumer demand, which is growing exponentially. We must make it a priority to increase the availability of spectrum for commercial use, both licensed and unlicensed, as quickly as possible. The upcoming spectrum auctions at the FCC are critical steps in the right direction, and I'll be following them closely. But we need to start thinking about what's next. At this point, there are no more large blocks of unused spectrum sitting around waiting to be assigned for advanced wireless services. We've already gone after the low-hanging fruit. So we're going to need to redouble our collective efforts to free up more spectrum, as well as using current spectrum in a more efficient manner. Spectrum users, be they government agencies or private companies, like having distinct frequencies of themselves. But in the future, we're going to need these spectrum users to start getting used to living much closer to each other. Think of it in terms of row houses and condo buildings rather than sprawling, spread out suburbs. Much like real estate, they're not making any more wireless frequencies, so we're going to need to get the most possible out of the current spectrum map. One of the biggest drivers of increasing wireless traffic is video, another area that is ripe for reform. As ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee, I'm currently working with my colleague, Chairman Jay Rockefeller, on a satellite TV reauthorization bill. The House version of this bill includes a number of video reforms, including on retransmission consent negotiations and cable set-top box policy. While it's too soon to say what the final satellite TV bill will include, it seems clear that there is interest in both chambers on updating our video laws, many of which were written in 1992 as part of the Cable Act. A great deal has changed in the video market in just the past 5 years, let alone since we last passed comprehensive video legislation 22 years ago. When Congress wrote the Cable Act, that never envisioned telephone companies entering the TV space, let alone companies like Netflix, TiVo, Amazon, Apple, and YouTube, revolutionizing how people watch video. And the Supreme Court will soon hand down a decision in the Aereo case that may have wide-ranging implications for the television industry. With so much having changed in the video marketplace, now is a good time for Congress to examine our laws to determine whether they are still relevant and whether they provide the foundation for continued video innovation and consumer choice. Just like telephone service, our video laws in large part reflect a monopoly market structure that no longer exists. And as with voice services, video services are quickly becoming applications that merely ride on top of the underlying competitive broadband network infrastructure. Failing to modernize these outdated laws would be a missed opportunity. From my position on the Commerce Committee and Republican leadership, I see every day the rewards and challenges of living through the digital revolution. The world moves so fast that it's hard for even the most technologically savvy and digitally connected person to keep up with everything. So it should be no surprise that our laws have fallen woefully behind. I can promise you that I will continue to work with my colleagues in the Senate to modernize America's digital policies, because we need 21st century laws for a 21st century world. I know that our next speaker, FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai, is just as committed to this effort as I am. I'm sure he'll be able to offer a unique perspective on communications reform from being in the trenches every day at the Commission. And he just came and visited the great state of South Dakota and got to observe up close and personal many of the things that we're doing in our state. And so I'm pleased that he was willing, along with Commissioner O'Reilly, to make that trip to South Dakota, and look forward to hearing from him, to working with he and his colleagues at the Commission on policies that are good for the future of this industry and good for the economy of our country. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Randy, for the great work that the Free State Foundation does. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Thune, for that very substantive address. I appreciate that very much. Senator Thune doesn't have much time, but he's allowing me to ask 2 questions. I'm going to make them not with 10 subparts and so forth, so I appreciate that. The first question, and they both relate to the Communications Act update and so on. The process that the House has begun, that you mentioned in your text of your speech and that I commented on, is underway now. There have been 3 white papers issued, and a bunch of responses, very substantive responses that have already been submitted. And so my question is this. You said that you're very hopeful next year the Senate gets underway with an updating process of its own, and particularly if the stars happen to be aligned properly. My question is, with the House having already started the process and done a lot of work, do you think that that would enable you, or you can be able to use what they've done and maybe accelerate and catch up on the Senate side?
I hope the answer is yes. I mean, I think that the House has done a great job getting out there. The white paper process that they put in place, I think, starts that discussion. And frankly, it's never too early to start. If we're going to do this, it means that people have to start giving a lot of attention to some of the particulars, and I appreciate the good work, the foundational work that the House of Representatives has already done. I hope that we in the Senate can build upon that and work with our colleagues in the House, and I do have fairly regular communications with them, as well as our staffs are in regular contact as well about where they're going, where they're headed, and it's critically important from the stakeholder community that everybody weigh into those discussions. And I know many of you are, and I appreciate the good work, as I said, Randy, that you and your organization has done in trying to move that ball forward and keep the pressure on and moving in the right direction. But we hope to be able to build upon what the House has begun and give them great credit for some of the things that they've already undertaken.
And then finally, since it's clear that on the Senate side, the updating process won't start until next year, can you just comment, Senator Thune, on what other telecom or technology priorities that you see the Senate might address for the rest of this year?
some things that are kind of must-do items. Stella, of course, as we said, expires. We're hoping to mark that up in the Commerce Committee sometime in the July work period. And right now, our staff and Senator Rockefeller staff are in discussions and negotiations about what that might look like. Of course, paying attention to what the House has already done. So that would be one thing that we would have to try and wind up here in the not too distant future, get that hopefully on a pathway to passage before the current act expires. The Internet tax moratorium, of course, expires November the 1st. I'm hopeful that we also will be able to get that extended permanently. I've got a bill along with Senator Wyden that is awaiting action in the Senate, and we got a little bit of progress on that in the House of Representatives just last week. So I'm hopeful that that will be something in the that will move as well in the next few weeks and months. Cybersecurity, something we've been working on in the Commerce Committee for some time, and I'm hoping that the Intelligence Committees and Homeland Security Committee also will do their part of it. It sounds like they're moving forward, and I'm hoping that they'll employ the light touch approach that we used at the Commerce Committee and come up with some legislation that might ultimately make it across the finish line. I think it's really important that we do that, and unfortunate that we haven't been able to keep it on the rails so far. But it looks like those other two committees that have jurisdiction are beginning to move forward, and if we can pair up what they've done with what the Commerce Committee has done here, there's been action in the House of Representatives on that issue as well, so I'm hopeful we might be able to get that across the finish line. And I guess the final thing I've mentioned is digital trade, which is also a priority. I've got a bill along with Senator Wyden as our trade negotiators go into these discussions, particularly on the European free trade agreement, making sure that we don't face a lot of digital protectionism in some of those agreements, and making sure that preventing that is a priority for our negotiators as they take on these trade agreements. But very concerned about what we're hearing rhetorically, at least from some of the European countries, with respect to that issue and what it could mean in terms of limiting the tremendous growth that we've seen in the digital economy globally, and the enormous opportunity that exists there for our economy and for jobs. So I'd say those are things that are kind of on our immediate radar. How many of those get transacted and completed this year remains to be seen, but hopefully for sure Stella, Internet tax moratorium, and it'd be great if we could get a cyber bill through. So.
Senator Thune, thanks again so much for that. As a token of appreciation, I wanted to give you a copy of Communications Law and Policy in the Digital Age the next 5 years. I know you may have 10 or 12 of these in your office already, but hopefully you can use one more. I brought another one, and I gave the one I inscribed to Q over there, so you're going to need to do a switch.
Okay.
But this was published in 2012, so it runs us up through 2017 with a real roadmap and some good ideas for reforming communications policy. And so that's the way of saying that I'm hopeful by 2017 we'll be able to write a new book, a Free State Foundation book on the new Communications Act at that time. But thanks so much. Everyone join me, and thank you, Senator Thune. Okay, well, we certainly have standing room only there, but the reality is we have seats now, and I'm going to call Commissioner Pai up now to come up. But while he's doing that, please take seats. There are seats throughout. I can see them, and I'm sure Commissioner Pai would just as well have you sitting as standing throughout. Okay, well, that really was a something of speech. I can't wait to read it again. Actually, read it because it's important. And I know I'm excited that following Senator Thune, Commissioner Pai is going to be speaking to us. I thought I couldn't think of any other person that I would want to give a view from the the FCC. I understand it might not be the absolute unanimous view by every single person on every issue, but I'm glad that we've got Senator Pai here to do that. So I'm going to introduce him. Well, maybe it will be. I have to tell you, when we exchanged emails just, to get ready and to remind Commissioner Pai that he was coming this morning and so forth, and what I hope to do, he wrote back and said, I told him that what I thought Senator Thune might talk about, and he sent me back an email that said he was going to talk about AM radio this morning, and that gave me a little start. And I told him I probably needed to be educated a lot in any event on AM radio, but fortunately he said he's going to talk about a bunch of other things. In emails sometimes you can't tell as you can if you're looking someone right in the eye how serious they are. But I'm anxious. That's another way of saying I'm really anxious to hear what he's going to talk about this morning. So I'm going to do, again, with his permission, the shorter version of this resume because, like Senator Thune, Ajit Pai has an impressive resume. So here's the quick version. He was sworn in as a commissioner on May 14th, 2012, and between 2007 and 2011, Commissioner Pai held several positions in the FCC, culminating in Deputy General Counsel at the Commission. He's worked in the private sector with a law firm, with a telecom company, but he's also, and this is, I think always strikes me when I reread his resume, he's had experience on the Hill. I think that was with the Judiciary Committee and maybe other committees as well. But and also in the judicial branch as well. And he worked in DOJ and then was a law clerk. So he's seen the government from all these different angles. I think the three branches is you might say, I always consider myself the FCC as one of those independent regulatory agencies, maybe the fourth branch. For a long time, I wrote a column for the Legal Times that was titled The Fourth Branch, the independent agencies. So with that, I'm happy to call to the podium Commissioner Ajit Pai, and anxious to hear his remarks about things other than AM radio.
Thanks, Randy, for that introduction. I especially appreciate your description of my career as you've given me a variety of perspectives on the issues. My mom would describe it as my inability to keep a job for more than a couple of years. But thank you for giving me this opportunity to address the Free State Foundation. It's an honor as well as a challenge to follow Senator Thune's keynote address. As you've just heard, Senator Thune is leading the charge for policies to promote innovation, investment, and opportunity. He's also a fierce advocate for rural America, and not least, he has the meanest jump shot of any Article I officer in Washington, D.C. We should all be thankful that he plays a leadership role in the United States Senate, and I especially appreciate his and his staff's graciousness in working with my office. It's also a bit daunting to talk about reforming the Communications Act and communications policy in the digital age at an event that Randy has put together. After all, he has literally written the book, as you've seen, on free market communications reform. In fact, I have a signed copy on my shelf at this very moment in the office. So, Randy, I want to apologize in advance if some of the ideas I offered this morning seem a little familiar. Now, I've been asked to give a view from the FCC, although apparently not on AM radio. I'd be happy to discuss afterward if members of the press are interested. But seriously, I'd like to start somewhere far from Washington, D.C. And I can hear the groans already, but fear not. This is not another story about growing up in southeast Kansas. No, this is a story about Chelsea Pickner. She started and owns Chelsea's Boutique, a bricks and mortar store in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And not long ago, Chelsea was a young woman with a worldly eye for fashion, but but a vision for selling primarily to women in South Dakota. But her work really took off once she started a website and began marketing her products on Facebook and other social media. Today, Chelsea has shipped her product to all 50 states. She can find a supplier anywhere in the world. And she's creating new jobs in Sioux Falls. Now, last month, as Senator Thune mentioned, he and I had a chance to visit Chelsea's boutique in Sioux Falls. We got to see firsthand how the internet can empower an entrepreneur to innovate and can allow a business to flourish anywhere in America. Now, in a way, what's most remarkable about Chelsea's story is how common it is. After all, social media is the new face of marketing. Writing code is the new opportunity for fame. About 460 apps are submitted to Apple's App Store every day. That's more than 80,000 new apps in the last 6 months alone. Every day we hear stories about startups trying to solve problems in novel ways. For instance, last week, or a couple of weeks ago rather, the FCC made an award to EasyChirp, which created a free web app that makes it easier to communicate on Twitter and optimizes the online experience for people with disabilities. In short, the internet has leveled the playing field so that consumers can access the best products at the cheapest price. And anyone who wants to compete for that business can do so easily and quickly. To borrow from Adam Thierer, from whom you'll hear shortly, broadband has made it easier for entrepreneurs to innovate without first asking for the government's permission. Now, what makes all of this digital innovation possible? Well, it's broadband infrastructure, and a lot of it. As Senator Thune pointed out, since the Telecommunications Act of 1996, telephone companies, cable operators, and wireless providers have invested $1.2 trillion to deploy broadband to the American public, with more than $68 billion coming in the last year alone. For those keeping score, that's $1 trillion more than the Universal Service Fund has ever distributed, and $60 billion more than it distributed in the past year. Now, it should be no surprise then that broadband is available to most Americans. For example, in 2012, wireless broadband was available to 99.8% of Americans, and fixed broadband was available to 96% of us. And Americans are subscribing. In fact, the number of broadband connections, 129 million, has now exceeded the number of households in the United States for the first time. Now, the credit for our country's successful fixed and mobile broadband markets goes to a 20-year bipartisan consensus that the internet thrives under minimal regulation. That consensus began with the Clinton administration's decision in the early 1990s to privatize the internet. It continued with Congress's statement in the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that the internet should remain unfettered by state and federal regulation. Then came the Clinton FCC's Stevens Report in 1998, which determined that internet access services are information services. And finally, the Bush administration in the FCC applied that decision to the various technologies that were used to access the internet. At each stage, policymakers realized that a light-touch regulatory environment was necessary to promote investment and to maximize the deployment of next-generation infrastructure. Now, to be clear, I do not mean to suggest that our nation's broadband policy has been perfect. It hasn't. There's certainly more that we could do and should do to clear out the regulatory underbrush that deters infrastructure investment and broadband deployment. But when it comes to the fundamental choice of a regulatory model, I submit to you that the United States has gotten it right. Now, of course, there are those who disagree, and their voices have become louder of late. Many are now claiming that the only way to protect the internet from ruin is to reclassify broadband as a Title II service. In other words, they want to end the minimal regulatory environment for broadband and replace it for rules that were based on 19th century railroad regulation. Now, in my view, this makes no sense. The common carriage rules of Title II were designed to control one company that had a monopoly on long-distance telephone service, not the 1,712 companies that now compete to provide broadband service to Americans. And beyond the sloganeering, there are any number of complicated questions to which I have yet to hear an answer. For instance, how much would consumers' broadband prices go up to pay for the universal service charges that all carriers must contribute? Why should we apply anti-consumer rules like tariffing to the broadband world? How would the Parts 36 separations process apply to apportion the various components of the network between the several states and the FCC for regulatory purposes? And why should we open the door to actual access charges imposed on edge providers, content delivery networks, and transit operators without their consent? Now, to be fair, some concede that not every provision in Title II should apply to broadband, and they claim to have a simple solution: forbearance. Now, I welcome these parties' newfound respect for the Commission's forbearance authority under Section 10 of the Communications Act. But I doubt that forbearance is the easy answer that some desire. And I fear that Title II supporters' enthusiasm for it will prove to be short-lived. I hope two examples will illustrate why. First, consider the FCC's resolution of a petition for forbearance that was filed by US Telecom a little while ago. Now, it took the Commission 13 months to grant relief on a 77-year-old requirement first imposed by the FCC's Telegraph Division, involving telegraph carriers' delayed and undelivered messages and money orders. And it took that long, even though the FCC staff had repeatedly recommended, without opposition, the deletion of that requirement dating back to the Clinton administration. Second example, consider the FCC's resolution of a forbearance petition in the Qwest Phoenix order. Qwest faced direct competition from cable operators, over-the-top VoIP providers, and wireless substitution as well. But the FCC refused to grant Qwest any regulatory relief. In fact, in the Qwest Phoenix order, the Commission dramatically raised the bar for granting such petitions. It essentially presumed that relief should be denied, and it imposed onerous, perhaps even impossible, evidentiary burdens on petitioners to prove otherwise in each particular geographic area for which they were seeking forbearance. Now, what all this means is that uncertainty will hang over the marketplace for a long time. For how many years would it take us to decide which parts of Title II would apply and which would not? In fact, how many provisions must we even examine? And when we still haven't collected the data in the special access proceeding, about a year and a half after authorizing that collection, how can we possibly expect to timely gather data on the wider broadband market? And in a rapidly changing industry, how enduring is a particular FCC snapshot of the marketplace really going to be, especially when critical investment decisions ride on that snapshot? But aside from the mechanics of implementing Title II, we need to ask a more basic question. Where would Title II regulation lead? One good way to answer this question is to compare the results produced by the American regulatory model to those of a more intrusive regulatory model, Europe's. Rather than taking a light touch regulatory approach to broadband, the European model treats broadband as a public utility. It imposes telephone-style regulation, and it purports to focus on promoting service-based rather than facilities-based competition. The results of the public utility model speak for themselves. 82% of Americans and 48% of rural Americans have access to 25 megabit per second broadband speeds. In Europe, those figures are 54% and 12%, respectively. These figures aren't skewed by less developed countries. In France, for instance, the figures are 24% and 1%, respectively. Similarly, American broadband companies are investing much more, in fact, more than twice as much as their European counterparts. $562 per household versus $244. They're also deploying fiber to the premises about twice as often, 23% versus 12%. Small wonder, then, that the European Commission itself has said that Europe is losing the global race to build fast, fixed broadband connections. Now, that's just on the fixed side. When it comes to mobile broadband, too, America is the undisputed leader. The The OECD reports that we have more than twice as many mobile broadband subscribers than any other country in the world. Our wireless providers have been aggressively building out their networks and upgrading capacity to meet consumer demand. The fastest mobile broadband technology in wide deployment, 4G LTE, now covers 86% of Americans. In Europe, that number is only 27%. And what about innovation at the edge of the network? Well, the United States, once again, is the unrivaled champion. What's the most popular social networking site in North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Australia? It's Facebook. And what's the most popular search engine on each of these continents? It's Google. I mean, other examples abound, but you get the point. I have yet to meet anyone who would trade our high-tech industry for Europe's. And that begs the question then, why would we ever want to abandon our regulatory model for Europe's? We know what the result would be. Less infrastructure investment, slower deployment of broadband, and less innovation. To me, the lessons are simple. Markets work. Incentives work. Antitrust works. If you want a booming communications marketplace, trust entrepreneurs to innovate without permission. If you want world-class broadband infrastructure, give American companies a reason to invest in their networks. Now, unfortunately, I don't believe that opponents of Title II regulation have been doing a very good job getting that message out. And if that doesn't change, I'm frankly very worried about the future of the American digital economy. Talking to each other inside the Beltway is good, but it isn't going to get the job done. The Title II advocates have been taking their case to the American people. And while I don't necessarily agree with their message, of course, they have framed it in a way that is resonating with many Americans. We have to do the same. As Vince Lombardi said, the best defense is a good offense. So let's engage with the public and present a message that will connect with Americans who don't work in telecom policy. Here's just one small example of how we could do that. Last week, as you may have heard, T-Mobile announced its Music Freedom Program. As a part of this program, T-Mobile will let customers use all the most popular music streaming services: Pandora, Rhapsody, iHeartRadio, iTunes Radio, Slacker, and Spotify on an unlimited basis without data charges. Customers will also be able to vote online to add new services to the Music Freedom Program. Now, T-Mobile's plan probably sounded like sweet music to millions of Americans who avoid streaming their favorite songs for fear of using up all of their monthly data. After all, streaming 30 minutes a day of music can consume about 900 megabytes of data per month, according to T-Mobile's own usage calculator. That's nearly half the allotment of a typical data plan. But T-Mobile's announcement hit a false note for one group of people, Title II advocates. Now, I've often said that net neutrality is a solution in search of a problem. But it appears that net neutrality supporters have finally found an actual problem that needs to be solved: free music. Fevered commentary suggests that T-Mobile's plan could kill wireless net neutrality. And, my favorite, is the most insidious type of net neutrality violation. Now, those of us who support light-touch regulation of the internet should engage in this debate and take our case to the American people. Should a carrier like T-Mobile be able to respond to consumer demand by offering free music to its customers? We say yes, and the supporters of Title II regulation say no. Is it good for competition when a carrier like T-Mobile seeks to differentiate itself from its competitors and offer innovative service plans? Again, we say yes, and supporters of Title II regulation say no. This is just one small example of a larger point that I think needs to be made today and every day henceforth. Competition, not preemptive regulation, is the best guarantor of consumer welfare. The convention of pitting the market against the consumer is as lazy as it is inaccurate. Markets have delivered far greater benefits to consumers than heavy-handed regulation ever has. And here's another point. Some have asked the FCC to embrace Title II regulation because they're worried that otherwise the internet will fundamentally change. This view is curious, to say the least. We must fundamentally change how the internet is regulated in order to preserve the status quo. It seems to me that if we don't want the internet to fundamentally change, then we shouldn't fundamentally change our regulatory model. But even conceding that point, if we are going to fundamentally change the way we regulate the internet, that decision should be made by the people's elected representatives, not 5 unelected members of the FCC who are standing on uncertain legal terrain, to put it kindly. The U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee has launched a multi-year effort to update the Communications Act. I applaud that effort, as well as Senator Thune's call this morning to embrace a similar task on the Senate side. And I hope that the end result is fewer barriers to broadband deployment and less regulation of the internet rather than more. But whether this debate takes place at the FCC or in Congress, we shouldn't let net neutrality supporters dominate the debate with a parade of hypothetical horribles. We need to iterate and reiterate that there will be consequences of embracing Title II. Because, make no mistake, there will be consequences. There is no free lunch here. But don't take it from me, a bureaucrat sitting in Washington. Listen to Mark Andreessen, the creator of the first widely used web browser, the founder of Netscape, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist, and hardly a defender of internet service providers. He recently observed, and I quote, "A pure net neutrality view is difficult to sustain if you also want to have continued investment in broadband networks. If you're a large telco right now, you have something you spend on the order of $20 billion a year on capital expenditures. You need to know how you're going to get a return on that investment. If you have these pure net neutrality rules, you're not ever going to get a return on continued network investment, which means you'll stop investing in the network." That is what would devastate the internet revolution. Not a wireless carrier letting its consumers stream free music. That wouldn't be good for you. That wouldn't be good for me. And that wouldn't be good for Chelsea Pickner in Sioux Falls and millions of other Americans like her. Those are the people to whom we need to be speaking. The people who rely on high-speed broadband to create a business, to see a doctor, to educate their kids, and for any other number of purposes. If we make a compelling case to them, I believe that we can preserve the regulatory model that has made the United States the envy of the world when it comes to broadband investment and innovation. But it all depends on what we do. I look forward to working with Free State, with members of Congress, with the American public on ways to ensure that the internet revolution proceeds apace. Thanks very much again for having me.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for those remarks. They really, I think, followed well and were important after Senator Thune's remarks. Commissioner Pai has agreed to take some questions, and so I want you to think of, start right this second and think of questions. If you don't, I will. But while you're thinking, what I want to do. So I don't forget, and so you have a chance to think. I'm going to go ahead right now, even before the questions, to present Commissioner Pai with just a token of appreciation. You heard him say that he had a book on his shelf, and that was very nice of you to say. I appreciate that, and I've foisted probably 5 or 6 on him, so it's probably true. But so knowing that, I want to present Commissioner Pai with our Free State Foundation blanket here. This unfolds, and it's a nice blanket. And I know we have a former general counsel of the commission here, Matthew Berry, Deputy General Counsel, and I think this is perfectly fine under the pertinent regulations. And in any event, Commissioner Clyburn accepted one of these. And we've got it on video at the annual conference that we did in March. So I'm sure it's absolutely kosher.
Well, thank you, sir. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay, now what we're going to do, if you have a question, raise your hand, and I'm going to recognize you for Commissioner Pai. Do we have a question from the audience? I can always count on Barron, and I'll get to him. Okay, well, I'm going to ask Barron to ask his question, and then if someone else has one, you can think of that as well. Remember, we just want to do questions here.
So, Commissioner Pai, Aaron Soka, Tech Freedom, do you think that under Chevron, it's a reasonable interpretation to think that Section 706, which the FCC proposes to rely on, is actually an independent grant of authority rather than a mandate to use other grants of authority in the act to promote broadband?
Thanks for the question. I'll get to it in a second. I just want to thank Randy for the blanket. It's a sad commentary on my life. The second I saw it, in the old days, I would have thought, hey, this is great for screen on the green. Now I'm thinking, this could be used for a diaper changing. This is great, fantastic. Thank you very much, Randy, for that. No, but Barron, to get to your question, I mean, I actually view the Chevron question in this case as more of a step one rather than a step two case. And it seems to me the text of Section 706 is pretty clear. And if you look at the legislative history, which, for the Scaliaites out there, I wouldn't necessarily endorse, of course, but if you do look at it, I think it's pretty obvious that Congress intended this to be more deregulatory provision rather than a springboard for inchoate future regulation of the internet, including edge providers. And so my own view is that as a Chevron step one matter, I would say the plain text militates in favor of light touch regulation, if any, unless the FCC finds that your broadband isn't being deployed in a timely fashion. I hope that answers the question.
And if they do find that?
Pardon me?
If they do make that finding, then what?
Oh, you're saying would they get Chevron deference? I mean, that's it's hard to say what the DC Circuit would do without knowing what the arguments were, what the panel was, how the argument proceeded, et cetera. But my own preference would be, of course, for the course, first the FCC and for the court to return to the text of 706. And if they do that, then I'm hopeful that, again, as a step one matter, the decision would be struck down.
Just a quick footnote or aside. In part of my life, I devoted to administrative law, and I've done that in different capacities for a long time. And I've read far more Chevron articles than I had ever hoped to and studied. But one thing I would say is that it's not even, obviously Chevron deference is strong deference, and it often works, but there are an awful lot of cases, I think you and Matthew would back me up on this, where for one reason or another, even when you get to the question of Chevron deference, the court, doesn't. It's not controlling. I think that's the word used in the Chevron case itself, controlling. And there are even cases that are curious, but they just occur where the court, in reviewing an agency rule, doesn't even cite Chevron for one reason or another. So it's not, it's not cut and dried that way. Okay, do we have another question for Commissioner Pai? Anna Maria up here. Just wait. Kathy, can you bring that mic up? And just for the record, identify yourself, if you would.
Sure. I'm Anna Maria Kovacs. I'm with the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy. You mentioned that forbearance is not quite as easy and automatic as some folks refer. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is if you apply Title II to broadband, for example, if I'm a state commissioner and I need money for universal service for the state universal service fund, and I notice $59 billion sitting on Google's last balance sheet in cash, YouTube looks an awful lot like an telecom service for me, and I can go after it for USF. Is there a case for that kind of thing?
A case to be made against that kind of thing? Or
A case to be made by a state commission for,
right.
Bringing in things like YouTube, Shutterfly, any number of platforms like that.
Absolutely.
Yes, telecom
Absolutely. I think I didn't mention it today, but one of the problems with opening up the Pandora's box of Title II is not just the prospect of federal regulation, which I think a lot of people have focused on almost exclusively, but it's the fact that then you would have 50 state jurisdictions who each get a bite of the apple. And so a provider, whether on the edge or a network provider, would then have to deal with a patchwork of state and federal regulations, which might be conflicting. And so I think that's an important dimension of the problem that has to be illustrated, which is that a lot of states have great interest in trying to figure out how to get revenue, to promote broadband within their own borders, and that's going to be difficult for us to handle.
Right. Thank you.
We've solved the world's problems.
Okay, well, we're just going to do one more question. So hopefully we have. So this will be the last question. But let me just say, as soon as Commissioner Pai answers this question and we bid him goodbye, then I'm going to call up the panel that follows. I promise this is going to be lively because it will be based on the composition, but I'm going to make sure it is in any event. So I don't want anyone to leave, and hopefully people in the back can even take seats. So that's what it's going to happen next. So you'll stay in place. So Scott, I guess on the theory that I'm going to ask you some questions, you get to ask a question here.
Can you give us your kind of overview and sense on the discussion about paperization or fast and slow lanes? Isn't the discussion or the debate over whether or not there is a zero price set by the FCC or whether or not people can have commercially reasonable private sector negotiations to determine how to deal with traffic?
I'm not familiar with that controversy, but I'll take a stab answering it anyway. No, I think the issue you've pointed out is an important one, that there isn't a lot of transparency into what the actual decision to ban pay prioritization or other commercially reasonable arrangements would involve. And so I think that, as you put it, zero pricing is an important factor that has to be taken into account. And I would also say that, and just as I pointed out in my statement that accompanied the net neutrality of open internet and NPRM, that the FCC has not done a good job, and the debate has not been informed by economic and technical considerations. I mean, a lot of people, for instance, don't have a sense of how Title II would operate in terms of the economic incentives for various players. And that's a pretty important thing for us to understand. And so that's one of the reasons why I called for us to convene a panel of economic experts to tell us, from various perspectives, what they think would happen. As I said in my speech, incentives matter and they work. And so if we provide improper incentives, that's going to be a big problem. On the technical side, too, I've been amazed by some of the commentary that just elides the entire structure of the internet, how it works, how it operates, and we don't have a lot of facts informing this decision. It's all, ISPs versus content providers, and there's an internet backbone. And, there's no really grappling with peering, with transit, with IP interconnection, all these other issues. And so that's why I would hope, and I personally have been involved in trying to talk to a lot of technical experts to understand the mechanics of how this would work and how it would change if the FCC's regulatory model changed. I also want to say before I close that I want to thank John Bergmayer for coming. I know it's an important conversation to have, and he's been a really effective advocate for his views. And I think that it's important as we seek to advance the public interest, as I know he believes in, that our perspectives are informed by free and open debate, by economic and technical perspectives, and from the views of ordinary people who rely on broadband. It shouldn't be just an inside the beltway type of war between warring factions. With that, thank you once again, Randy, for inviting me. Thanks for the questions, and as always, I try to be as accessible as possible, so get in touch if you have any questions or tomatoes to throw.
Okay, I'm going to ask our panel to come up. Now, they're going to take questions as well. So it's a lot of advance notice that you should think of questions for the three panelists as well. Is anyone having a hard time getting on Wi-Fi? Are you on? Are you? What do you want to say if they are?
You should get on the ABC network, and it may be a string of all the network names, but it would start with ABC. And then you connect. You go to your browser at that point, and that should redirect you to the page where you put in the username, which is case sensitive, and then you put in the password and ignore the profile name. That's not necessary. And if you're still having an issue, you can come back and I can go over it again.
Okay. Yeah, we want you to tweet away. We actually had the handle I didn't mention earlier, but you probably figured it out. Hashtag reform policy. That's the official hashtag, so tweet away. Okay, well, I'm really pleased that we have assembled this group of experts, and like Commissioner Pai, I want to especially thank John Bergmayer for being here, but the others as well. John has been, I think you've been at previous events, but Gigi Sun, before she took her exalted office, used to be a regular as well. So I'm going to do the quick introduction so we can get into it. And I'm going to ask them to each panelist, and so they know this hopefully, but they can be thinking about it, to speak for just 3 or 4 minutes initially, and then we're going to hopefully mix it up. And I'm going to ask John to speak first because he may have a lot already has been said that he might want to respond to get us started in the conversation. Okay, so we've got you've got these full bios, of course, but John Bergmayer is senior staff attorney at Public Knowledge, specializing in telecommunications, internet, intellectual property issues. Okay, Scott Cleland is president of Precursor LLC, a Fortune 500 research consultancy specializing in the future of internet competition, property rights, privacy, cybersecurity, and cyber ideology, algorithm markets, and communications competition and deregulation. And then finally, Adam Thierer is a senior research fellow with the Technology Policy Program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and he specializes in technology, media, internet, free speech policies, with a particular focus on online safety and digital privacy. And with respect to Adam, I'm just going to indulge myself with the extra sentence because he's a former colleague of mine. And he's written a number of books, but the most recent is a book that Ajit Pai just mentioned, Permissionless Innovation. It almost fits in your pocket, or does, if you have a true pocket, the right size pocket. So I'm sure that's well worth your time. So with that, John, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm hoping that you'll react to Senator Thune and Ajit Pai, and obviously say whatever else you want. But just take about, let's say about 4 minutes, 5 minutes to begin with, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure, I was taking some notes while they were speaking, so I've got quite a few things to respond to. I mean, let me just say to begin with, of course, right when I'm going to go sit on this panel, the area decision comes out, which is something that I've been working on, so I'm going to try to focus on the topic at hand instead of just at 10 a.m. Reversed and remanded 6-3.
Okay, well, let's
focus on today's issue. So the 1996 Telecom Act, when it was passed, most consumer internet access was over a Title II service. Dial-up internet access existed. It was an information service, yes, but you accessed that information service over your phone lines, which were a Title II service. Almost all of the thinking about telecommunications and internet access policy at that time, which people keep going back to, happened along a backdrop when a telecommunications service was available to the public. It was only later, really around 2005, when we sort of moved away from that, where it was held that the entire stack, including the wire to your house, was a Title I service. So I think it's important to remember that the growth of the commercial internet happened because of Title II. Dial-up ISPs. The ILECs went to the FCC. The ILECs wanted dial-up ISPs to be regulated. They wanted to charge them interconnection fees. They wanted to put them out of business. They didn't like these people riding on their wires for free. But luckily, policymakers saw the wisdom of saying that the person who's providing infrastructure to your house has to operate it in a non-discriminatory way. And at that time, that meant a competitive landscape of ISPs, which we've lost. And in terms of Title II, we've had this explosive growth of mobile phones, which people keep returning to. They are regulated under a Title II service. Not only that, not only are mobile phones all Title II services, they have a forbearance statute. The first forbearance statute was enacted for commercial mobile radio services, not for landline Title II. So when you're looking at the success of Title II and what Title II can do, it's actually a very flexible provision that is not narrowly tailored only for the monopoly era Bell system, but has been applied widely, not just to internet access, but to interconnection and other matters. So I think when we're looking at Title II, I think it's also important to remember the distinction between internet access and the internet. We are not calling, Title II advocates are not calling for the regulation of the internet, but for internet access services. And I see the conflation of the internet with the infrastructure providers who provide access to the internet. That's sort of akin to giving electricity companies or power companies credit for the innovations that happen in electronics and consumer electronics and appliances. I mean, it's ridiculous. There's a clear distinction, I think, between the infrastructure providers and the innovative services that people buy people buy internet access and it's valuable, but it's valuable not in and of itself, but for what you can get with it. So, and finally, I would say on the Title II point, it's never been just about monopoly, and common carriage has been about many other things, such as concerns about vertical integration, and it's older than the telephone system. Common carriage rules are older than not only railroads, not only telegraphs, but common carriage principles have been applied to many different technologies at many different times over the years. The exact application of those broad principles to new technologies changes over time. But to say that they're somehow obsolete is strange. In the hearing the other day, people were trying to say that antitrust is long established and Title II is new, and that's not true at all. Antitrust goes back to about the 1880s, 1890s, and the progressive movement, and common carriage is much older than that. I don't think I'm going to go down every last point. I'll say some of the things that I agreed with in the comments that were made, because there's actually quite a few areas where I agree with some of my more libertarian friends. I absolutely agree that we need to free up more spectrum for various uses. I don't believe that spectrum in the long term is scarce, and our policy should encourage spectrum sharing and new opportunistic uses. The best proving ground for that, I tend to think, is unlicensed. However, I think we need to have a balance of unlicensed and licensed spectrum. And I also very firmly agree, I disagree on the details, but I definitely agree that probably the area of communications policy that is most ripe for reform is the video regulation. The entire business model of networks to local affiliates to broadcasters to cable companies and the ways they interact is all basically enshrined in law, in statute and FCC regulation, and that makes increasingly less sense as people want to access more over-the-top video services.
Okay, well, I'm taking that as a reservation of some of your time for further rebuttal then. Scott, you're next.
Thank you. I'm going to just, I have to come back and address some of John's points, but I wanted to say that Senator Thune, I thought it was one of the more thoughtful speeches and very informed. I was very pleased to hear it about the support for modernization and how he has obviously thought this through and made it a priority. I mean, what we have right now is we have the most modern part of the economy. You know, all of us, there's 184 million of us that carry these around, and several tens of millions of tablets and whatever. It's the most modern part of the economy that is governed by the most obsolete, most out-of-date law. It's just something that you can't square that circle. And what happens is you wherever you move, there's the threat. Right now, what we're talking about at the FCC is, can 3 votes decide to change policy, what normally you would think that the Congress would have to do and the President would have to sign. So it's remarkable. The other thing is just to say, as a scene setter on spectrum, spectrum management in the government is the least efficient part of the market, of the government, period. Now, why would I say that? Why is it not hyperbole? It's $1 trillion asset. It's essential to the growth of the future economy. It is the only resource in government that has no one, and I'm telling you, no one accountable for how it's managed. Basically, it's governed by a 1979 law that was basically an executive order that arranged for a committee to basically talk about within the government how they handle spectrum. There is nobody that can tell, oh, wait a minute, you need to move that, you need to do this. It's not, so we manage land, we manage all types of federal property, gold, oil, all these types of things have accountability. I mean, what a concept. I mean, it is scandalous what is going on with spectrum in our country. We have $1 trillion asset that is being mismanaged, that is desperately needed. And I think it's an area where just good government, modernizing this part should be near unanimous in the Congress if they focus on it and realize that there is no one minding the spectrum store in the government. Now, real briefly, because I'm sure we can get back to this, John mentioned he rewrote the history of the 96 Act and broadband development. Let me give, I covered it very closely as an analyst, so, and other people that did at that time can, Anna Marie, you did as well. There are many people here that know it intimately and how it happened. And, the Telecom Act took a monopoly and said, let's go to competition. Surprise, surprise. When it was a monopoly, it was Title II. So in the beginning, it was Title II. But it didn't really take off. Internet access took off. Broadband did not. Even though modems were invented decades before that time, the FCC, trying to get modems into the world and, deployed, I mean, it was all about reselling, the slow 56K squeaking service at that time. And what people don't realize is that then under Title II, it created these incentives for arbitrage. And we had CLECs. And CLECs came in and said, hey, let's do reciprocal compensation. Let's have one-way economics where basically the CLEC always wins and the incumbent always loses, and that's how we get competition. And what happened? All CLECs went bankrupt. All of them. Like $300 billion just crushed. Then of the $4 trillion tech bubble, $1 trillion of it was the fiber bubble. We went from 3 fiber backbones to 16. People remember like PSINet and whatever. And so when people in the tech bubble, a lot of it was fueled. Remember when Lucent and Alcatel and all those companies were just sky high? Well, it was because the FCC under Title II logic said, we're going to pick winners and we're going to pick losers. And what competition is redistribution of market share. What happens when you have that uneconomic thinking is you have enormous distortions and enormous bubbles and messes. The CLECs all went bankrupt. Those fiber backbones almost all went bankrupt. And so when we went to Title I in 2004, surprise, surprise, what happened? Broadband took off because there was none of this Title II wet blanket put over it. And so it was, when Title II was lifted off this, that's when things took off. When, it's no mistake that the smartphone and the iPhone came about in a Title I world. In the Title II world, they wouldn't have seen the light of day. Why do I say that? Do you know when the cell phone was invented? 1949. Do you know when AT&T asked the FCC to pilot the service? 1949. Do you know when they first approved it? Like 1982, a little bit in 79, but they had to wait until Japan and Sweden did it first, even though it had been invented 30 years earlier. So the concept that Title II is somehow pro-innovation or a good thing or led to growth, it was when Title II was lifted off that the internet, broadband internet, took off.
Okay, Scott, thank you very much. I am going to give John, before we move to then the real fix-it-up questions, and John, I'm going to give you a chance to just respond, and then we'll mix it up. Next is Adam. You're next.
Well, thanks, Randy, and thanks for having me here. thought a fun place to start would be by mentioning to the crowd that you and I were reminiscing before the show started about the first time we met back in 1990, I guess it was 8, maybe 7, and how we were talking about all of the same issues we're talking about here today. You came to me looking to get into the think tank world, and Randy was just bubbling with excitement at that point about the exciting opportunities to get into this field and do telecommunications and media policy at that time. And why not? These were the heady days of the mid-90s when we thought we were going to do some really bold things in a very short amount of time. Randy was as giddy as a schoolgirl about to meet Justin Bieber, I would say. He was so excited to get in the field. He was asking young Adam Thierer for a job, in fact, in the think tank world. Thankfully, he finally found one, but I think demoralizing to both of us is the fact that we are basically talking about the exact same set of issues here today that we were talking about at that lunch table at the Occidental in 1997 or 8. It's just kind of sad that things haven't changed that much, at least in terms of the regulatory structures that we're dealing with in policies in this period of time. Those same regulatory roadblocks are alive and well today, and frankly threatening to grow and encumber new technologies and new sectors. I would suggest, however, that the most important thing we did do back at that point in time, not Randy and me, but all of us in this country, is that we decided essentially through a series of policy steps, some intentional, some accidental, to essentially firewall off this emerging digital economy and this thing called the internet from this long, ugly history of communications and media regulation. And through a series of policy actions at that time, we decided to essentially say that software, computing, digital communications, the internet economy would not be regulated by the same set of rules that covered those other sectors. What we instead did with the digital economy is we embraced the ethos that we now call permissionless innovation. The idea that you should generally be free to experiment with new innovations and technologies and business models and ways of doing things without having to first seek someone's blessing or prior approval before you offer a new innovative device and or service. And this really resulted in a blossoming of innovation that's almost unparalleled in modern capitalist history. So much so that today you find surveys, I found just one recently from Booz & Company, about the most innovative companies in the world, a survey they do every year and they've done for many years running now. And despite all the griping people do about American innovation, what's amazing about this list is how now, year after year, Americans are dominating. American companies are 9 of the top 10 most innovative companies on the globe in this list. 7 of the 10 on this list are involved in computing, software, and digital technology. And then just last week, CNBC came out with its Disruptor 50, its survey of the 50 most disruptive companies in the world, and only 5 of the 50 on this list were from abroad. The rest are American, and the #1 most disruptive sector was software and computing. That has to tell us something. We had to do something right policy-wise to assure that result. It wasn't just about other natural market forces. And again, I would suggest that it goes back to our embrace of the idea of permissionless innovation, the idea that somehow we can embrace the notion that we can get around these innovations without having to seek prior approval. To just give you a quick framing of how this has played out relative to the traditional communications and media sectors, think about modern internet and digital economy policy relative to traditional spectrum policy that Scott just talked about. I mean, think about how hard it is to just start a new wireless venture or platform or service versus starting a new web-based service or digital application. Steve Jobs didn't need any special regulatory blessings to launch his endless series of innovations over the last 10 to 15 years. iPads, iPhones, iTunes, whatever. He just did it. Google and Microsoft didn't need to file forms of any agency asking how to create innovative search engines, operating systems, email systems, web browsers, or video sharing services, all of which have in just the last 15 years radically disrupted traditional media and communications markets precisely because they didn't have to go through that process. When Uber and Lyft realized they could offer the public vastly superior transportation services by creating innovative online networking services, they launched those services. They went ahead and did it without prior approval. Of course, now a lot of people are pushing back on that. And Mark Zuckerberg didn't need to petition anybody for permission to launch Facebook and voluntarily provide a massive universal service to over 1 billion people on the globe and offer them a chance to connect at the most awesome, fair, and non-discriminatory price of all time, $0.00. Could anyone have divined that beforehand if we would have sat down and tried to create the world's biggest social media platform using some sort of title of the Communications Act? So I want to make clear, this is not just about the big dogs and their ability to innovate. As Commissioner Pai rightly said, it's people like, I think her name was Chelsea Pickner, and all the other small mom and pop small innovators out there that are able to offer new innovative services and platforms without asking anyone's permission. Again, permissionless innovation has worked wonders. Now compare that to the world of trying to create certain types of new wireless services. There's endless permissioning required, endless paperwork, licensing, and permits to be filed and granted. Months, years go by before certain services and spectrum get allocated or reallocated. Armies of lawyers and lobbyists must be hired to permission for these blessings. And then there's the layers of state and local authority that you have to deal with on this front. And then don't forget about the formidable tax barriers. Again, we got the policy right here too with regards to the internet, with things like the Internet Tax Freedom Act. By contrast, look at the burdensome and discriminatory way we tax wireless cellular services in this country. It's insanity. So just in closing, I'll just say that what this reflects philosophically to me is the difference between the imagined public interest and the real public interest. There's a lot of talk in this town about serving the public interest. I believe in serving the public interest. Hey, I'm in the public. I want cool stuff. I want great services. I want it at a fair price. But when people promise it to me, their promises seem fairly empty when it's imposed by top-down command and control regulation. The reality is that nobody can be a technological Nostradamus and stare into a techno crystal ball and divine our high-tech future. We have to allow this to play out through the natural interaction of consumers and companies interacting in a free and open marketplace, constantly recalibrating their needs and desires to find new and better ways of doing things. That has happened with our digital economy precisely because we did not follow the path set forth in an archaic Communications Act that was passed well in the past that is now still threatening to be applied not just to these new technologies, but is still applied to all of these other sectors and burdening them that they could also benefit from the same idea of permissionless innovation. Thank you.
Adam, thank you very much. So you guys in the audience now continue to think of questions. So we're going to get to you. I'm going to get to John. And John, I'm just going to frame, I want to come back at you with something that you said. You could maybe discuss this and then anything else you want to for a few minutes. But this has always bothered me, frankly, so I've got you here. You said during the Title II era, let's just talk about the late 1990s, before the classification of broadband as an information service, that in that regime you could have, for example, with DSL, the underlying service was, the transmission service was regulated as Title II, and then you had the others on top of it. You said there was lots of competition among information providers, online providers. You said there was lots of competition. And in fact, back in the day, it used to be said that there were 6,000, that was the number, and I think in old pleadings of yours and others, there were 6,000 internet service providers in the nation, before the reclassification. So the question to you is this, really, because to me, there may have been 6,000 firms calling themselves, internet providers, but 5,990 of them or whatever were not using any of their own facilities. They, as you know, were just riding on top of the companies that had the underlying facilities, like a Verizon, or AT&T. My question is, in most of those, I had some experience with some of them, as some of us older people in the room, they were just offering pretty much a plain vanilla type of access service. And my question to you is, do you believe that in that model, when you talk about all that competition, even if you want to cite this 6,000 number that used to appear, do you really believe that is real competition? that is ultimately benefiting the consumers when they're not investing in their own facilities and just reselling a service, which is what they were doing.
Sure, I can
you
answer.
take that, and then you can take another couple minutes.
Sure, I mean, I don't think it's true that they didn't provide any of their own facilities. They didn't provide the last mile connection to the user's house. Dial-up ISPs are a model that's very similar to policies that exist around the world called open access policies, where you separate out the infrastructure provider from the service provider. The service provider can add value on top of the basic connectivity from the user's house to some central facility. Open access policies can be done with DSL, they can be done with fiber, they can be done with cable, and they can be done with wireless. And that's sort of similar to what we had back in.
They weren't doing any of those things. They were just on top of the telephone company. They weren't.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I subscribed to an ISP myself that did quite a few things that are beyond what other ISPs did. The ISP that I first subscribed to started life as a BBS, and it offered quite a number of services that were on BBS type services. If people remember door games, and they had their own little message board and things like that. On top of that, it provided me with a Unix shell account, which I used back in the slow dial-up days. I found using that was more convenient than just doing a direct connection to the internet. And then on top of that, they offered vanilla internet access. So you're right, a lot of them did offer vanilla internet access. But even if I grant your point that all they were doing was providing vanilla internet access, that provided a level of price and quality competition. If one of them, it kept prices low, and it made sure that they invested and they had the availability where people can use them. So I do think that kind of competition at the service provider level benefits consumers. It is true, you didn't have competition among different people all providing wires into the customer's home. And I would like to just point out something that Senator Thune raised about the level of competitiveness in the United States broadband market. Monopoly versus total, enough competition is not either or. According to the FCC's numbers, if you start a threshold of 6 megabits downstream, about 42% of Americans have access to only one provider, and another 40% have access to two providers. So here you have a high majority of the United States population that has access only to, for residential broadband, at most two providers. When you start adding
to wireline, you're not
fixed,
excluding wireless.
I'm not excluding wireless. I'm counting only fixed connections, not mobile. And fixed connections can include satellite and can include wireless connections. But if you use a speed threshold, a technology-based threshold, rather than a technology threshold, the majority of people who can afford it tend to subscribe to both mobile and fixed services. So I think that's demonstration enough in the marketplace that those are complementary services. And there's this one final thing I'd like to say, two final things. It's number one, Carter phone, which was a decision that said that people could attach their own equipment to the telephone network. That was yet another decision that was based on Title II. Title II is, like I say, it's a very broad doctrine. And basically, the FCC in the 1960s said it was per se unreasonable under Title II for the phone company to tell you what equipment you can and can't use on the phone system. And I have to just say this again. Every smartphone sold in America is a Title II device. They are all Title II today. Voice service and text on your iPhone is Title II. The wireless component, the data component is not. But it is not the case that somehow Title II has prevented the explosion of mobile. And it's not like wireless companies, for the most part, if you go into a T-Mobile or an AT&T store and ask them to give you a phone that doesn't have a phone connection and is data only, they'll tell you to buy a tablet. They won't sell you a phone that doesn't have voice. They still want to sell you that Title II service. It doesn't seem to be an impediment to their investment in growth. And finally, on the point of permissionless innovation, and I want to relate that to T-Mobile's Music Freedom Plan, because it is not the case that T-Mobile is giving you free music today. They're giving you free music on some popular services. None, by the way, that I subscribe to. And I'd like to know, what is the mechanism by which a local radio station that offers a streaming service of its own, as almost all of them do today, can get its connection also exempted from T-Mobile's data cap? That seems like quite a burden. So it would be, maybe it'd be having a different conversation if T-Mobile found a way to exempt music from its data cap, but it didn't. It only exempted a certain number of popular services with no clear and transparent way for services that are not on the list and not available to be voted on to be included in that. And that's the problem we have, is that it puts smaller services at a disadvantage almost by the very structure of the way it's
Just to be clear on that, so you oppose to T-Mobile?
Yeah, we have some serious concerns with it, as we've stated.
Okay, Scott.
Yeah, just would like to point out that, remember, there's a smartphone. And everything that John said about the phone, the phone part might be Title II, but everything smart about it is not Title II. And we talk about iChat, we talk about all the other services, and people use their smartphone. I know the younger folks use it almost never as a phone. I never can get my kids to call me back. It's all I have to text or I do something else. So this is not a Title II device. This is a Title I device. Everything that matters and why you have it is because of Title I. I'd like to step back, though, when we talked about, John was mentioning about electricity and they were taking credit for everything on top of it. This Title II discussion, we need to just go back to basics on understanding utilities. Electricity, gas, and water. Why are the utilities? Because they do one thing over and over again. It never changes. It's one standard, and it has facility monopoly economics. But it's unchanging. You can't do lots of things. It does the exact same thing every time, never changes. Communications is different. Now, you can communicate not just over that copper wire. And I must admit, back in 92, 93, 94, when I first started as a telecom analyst, I thought that it was a natural monopoly until I started understanding the technology. You can do broadband over electrically, over copper, over a coaxial cable, or a bunch of other types of metal wires. You can also do communications over fiber optics optically. You can do it electrically, you can do it optically, and then you can do it wirelessly. We know we can do it not only by Wi-Fi, it's unlicensed, or wireless, it can also be done by satellite. And you can also do it over broadband power lines. It hasn't been economic, but you can do it there. You can do it, there's even sewer gas. They figured out that they could do communications over. Innovation can deliver communications in an innumerable number of ways. Now the relevance of that is if you want Title II, you're assuming it can only be done as a basic service one way. It can be done electrically, unlimited ways, optically in many different ways, wireless in an unimaginable number of ways. And so it's not a monopoly service. It can be done by lots of people, lots of startups in different ways. Can it get to scale? That may be a different question. But communications is not like electricity, it's not like water, and it's not like gas. And it shouldn't be regulated like them.
Okay, Scott, when you started to get down into sewer, then I knew it was time that we needed to move on. So, Adam, do you want to come back at either of these two on anything before we?
Well, I'll just say very briefly, because I'd love to hear from the audience. Very briefly, it's easy to wax nostalgic about some of the glorious old days of thousands of ISPs. That market just wasn't sustainable. There's no way we were ever going to be able to sustain that sort of an environment. A lot of them were fly-by-night operations. I remember the guy running my first ISP operating out of his garage, and there would be hours that would go by where I would wonder, like, is this guy ever going to answer his phone? And, my little, 14.4 modem and trumpet windsock just wouldn't, always be reliable for me. And, so it had to become more of a big boys business. There was going to be consolidation. There was going to be a washing out of some of these companies. Now, as Scott suggested, that doesn't mean it's a monopoly. There are plenty of competitors still, but the reality is that, this is a high fixed cost, high sunk cost business. This requires massive investment. And we had that horrendous, Telric, UniP, CLEC experience where we created this sort of Potemkin Village competition fiction where we were just propping up empires of paper in the name of competition, as if just more automatically equals better. No, not necessarily. I mean, I don't want 15 search engines. We've only really got 2 big players there and a couple of smaller ones. The rule of 3 dominates all digital markets. After a while, there's a washing out period. And I don't care what layer of the internet you want to look at, not just communications and media, the internet, there's a washing out phase where you get down to the fact that there's a couple of big players in each of these sectors, from search to email to storage to other things. So the reality is what marketing folks call the rule of 3 comes to settle in. A big dog, a second competitor that's always nibbling at the heels, and then some third smaller niche players that provide certain roles and services. It's the same for the internet space as it is for traditional communications. And and media. So, I mean, we should understand that those are the sort of economic realities of this marketplace. The idea of thousands of ISPs would have only been frozen into place by regulation.
Okay, thank you, Adam. We do pride ourselves at the Free State Foundation in giving the audience a chance to ask questions, and you know, this time you can even just make a comment or a suggestion if you want to, because it helps us think about these issues and learn. So, who has a question or comment out there? Okay. First, I'm going to recognize this gentleman up front now. If you can just identify yourself for the record, we'd appreciate that. Oh, right there. Yeah, right there.
Hi, Aaron Bisla from the American Legislative Exchange Council. I have a question for Scott. You were very vocal about supporting unlicensed use of the 5G or of more spectrum, basically freeing it up by the FCC. I was wondering, what's your take on providing more spectrum for licensed versus unlicensed use, and what are the benefits to each?
Good question. I think that on the lower from 3 gigahertz and down to about 400 megahertz, so that 2.6 gigahertz, that is an area where it should be sold and auctioned. There's a huge market for it. And so for that, I believe it should be licensed. It should be out there. You can quibble at 3. Could it be a little higher than 3? That's the area where I think the industry is there's a lot of consensus around 3 is where they would like it to be licensed, because there's the economics for it to be a good and large and successful business. Above that, like certainly above 4 and 5, for unlicensed, makes a ton of sense. Wi-Fi has baby monitors, car door openers, all sorts of things. Those were unregulated kind of uses, and there's a tremendous amount of use and a tremendous amount of innovation that can happen there. So the way I look is there's a rough number about below 3 gigahertz to about 400 megahertz. That area should be sold. And the amazing thing is we can quibble. When I first looked at it, I said about 85% of that choice spectrum was controlled by the government, and it's at least 2/3, and most of it is DoD. And people like the U.S. Mint has spectrum now, and the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. It's one location. I don't know who they need to be communicating with, but I mean, this is spectrum that was allocated decades and decades ago, and they like it, and they don't know what they're going to use it for, and most of them don't use it. And so we've got to get the government, which is the dominant user of this commercial space, where they got it back, at a time when there wasn't the possibility of digital communications, back in the 70s. So they think it's still in the analog world. So the scandal it is a scandal. It should be opened up for auction under 3 gig.
I might just add that Senator Rubio is just introduced legislation in this very area. I won't try and detail it, but it deals with these questions, particularly government spectrum and how to repurpose that. And so that's worth taking a look at. As many of you may remember, Senator Rubio, about a year ago, gave his first major speech in the telecom area at Free State Foundation conference. So I urge you to take a look at this legislation.
I second that's a great start in the legislative arena.
Okay, Gary.
Thank you. Good panel. Gary Arlen from Arlen Communications. Referencing Senator Thune's comment and also the news we've all been reading about the area of the 6-3 decision, is the Telecom Act at all, in your view, going to talk about broadcasting, broadcast spectrum decisions in the Act? And the ruling today seems to give broadcasters a little breath of life for a little while. Do you want to talk anything about the future broadcasting in light of this and other issues about spectrum usage?
Okay, well, John, some of us probably haven't read it, but I know John's been involved in it. I think I saw him reading it probably. So
no, I wouldn't do that.
You have a 2 cents.
So
you're all done there, John? You got your analysis ready?
So since since the beginning of my interest in the Aereo case, I've been at pains to distinguish it from telecommunications because it's a copyright case. It's a copyright case that has implications on the telecommunications marketplace for sure, but it's about the interpretation of the Public Performance Clause under the Copyright Act. So as someone who works on both, I try to keep them separated in my mind. I'm aware of the policy overlap, but I don't think it'll have much of an effect on broadcasting. Even Area 1, I don't think it would have had much of an effect because it's not like cable companies could somehow not pay retransmission consent fees if they want to carry the full range of cable programming. And as to the issue of broadcasting, I think that broadcasters in general are propped up by a lot of regulations that sort of keep their business model in place, but also from the broadcaster's perspective, you don't always hear this from the NAB. Regulations keep them from adapting their business models. So it's not like I have these individual companies called broadcasters and people have like a vendetta against them. I think it would be great if they had more flexibility to offer new kinds of different services on their spectrum. So I think that in part of our spectrum policies and as part of our media policies, we need to find ways to allow the video marketplace to evolve and for companies to find their place in the new reality, which is partly driven by technology, but partly driven by consumer expectations of what they want out of video.
Just very briefly on Gary's question, I think regardless of today's decision in Aereo, the reality is that the good news is we are dealing with video marketplace policy right now. There's quite a few bills out there. Recently released a paper at the Mercatus Center on an overview of video marketplace reform efforts and the 6 or 7 leading bills that are out there, including Representative Scalise's important bill, which is probably the most comprehensive of all of them. I think that's the good news. There's a lot of interest in this. The bad news is there's so many moving parts to this. John mentioned some of the copyright elements, which are obviously part of the Aereo decision, but then there's retrans, and there's must carry, and there's media ownership, and there's network exclusivity issues, and on and on and on. And because of the multiple overlapping and sometimes contradictory layers associated with video marketplace and comprehensive or compulsory licensing issues, the reality is that there's always something that ends up holding up the process of reform. The hope with something like the Scalise bill was always that by bringing it all together and making it sort of an all or nothing kind of deal, we'd finally get it done. Boy, I hope that works, but I'm very skeptical that it will.
So John, let me just follow up with you on this way since we're talking about video now. Question was about broadcasters because you said in your initial remarks that video, because of I think you said video competition, that there may be changes in terms of relaxing certain rules in the video area that you're supportive of or something to that effect. And of course that's something that I've supported for a long time. And so the Scalise bill, for example, at least the model is something I supported. But here's my question to you. Can you be more specific
Sure.
now and tell us what it is that you would support in the way of deregulation or less regulation in video? And I know for myself, I know this is true for Adam and probably Scott as well, a lot of these issues we also see through the prism of the First Amendment when the marketplace changes and there may be a less compelling reason to regulate. So let's see how close maybe we can come together here. Tell me what you can about that.
Sure. I mean, there's various rules which basically give local broadcasters exclusive rights to certain content that they can enforce at the FCC beyond contract law, beyond copyright law, syndicated exclusivity, network non-duplication, things like that. They don't make a lot of sense. It's absolutely true. If you repeal them, they might simply be reintroduced via private contracting and enforceable through the courts, and that would be fine. But I think that having specific FCC policies that say this is how the business model for local broadcasting will be don't make a lot of sense. Another example is the way that cable and satellite companies carry programming. They get a copyright license that's a compulsory statutory license that they pay a government-determined fee, and then that clears them for copyright purposes. And then they have to negotiate with the local broadcaster for a signal right, not for copyright to that content. Why do we have this layering of something called a signal right on top of copyrights, which we then extinguish with a compulsory license? Why can't copyright itself simply handle the interactions of programmers, broadcasters, networks, and cable companies? I think it would be very hard to get there because there's been so many business expectations built up around the current system. So I might advocate for a more nuanced approach than the Scalise approach, which is just repeal it today and let them figure it out. I might advocate for something a little more slow and staged, but I think it can be done, and I think it's a good goal, and it's a goal that I share with a number of people from across the political spectrum. And in possible ways to get there, I noticed that it's only the satellite industry that has every 5 years to return to Congress to get one of its provisions that it needs to operate, given the overall regulatory environment, renewed. It's one of its copyright licenses expires every 5 years. So how about this time, instead of just making it so that, why don't we just renew everything, but also say, oh yeah, in 5 years, the following other things are going to expire, so that you have the political will where it's not just the satellite industry, but maybe the cable industry, maybe the broadcast industry that has to go up to Congress again to try to get their things renewed, and then maybe that provides an opportunity for reform. So that's one way I've been thinking about it, is it's always easier to kick the can down the road, and this 5-year expiration seems to be a handy way of doing it.
Yeah, 5-year plans are good. That's why we under a book, right, the next law and communications policy, the next 5 years.
But I'll tell you, I do like the idea of having, this stuff sunset and reauthorization in order to have any regulation continue. So I like that idea in the sense of having regulation go away if it's not reauthorized. But we have to know with video and with broadcast, cable under the 92 Act is ruled under the law as a monopoly. It has a monopoly for years. It's lost 40% of the market to DBS and to the telcos, and it's just the fact predicate, just like on telecom, where 22%, as Senator Thune said, still use the phone. Fact predicate, it's not a monopoly anymore. It's regulated that way. You have an analog broadcast regulated industry. It's not a digital. It's a digital industry. They only have 10% or less. Listening to people, getting broadcast over the air. So that's an obsolete analog model as well. So the act, those are real thorny issues. I was hearing what both of them have talked about with this. It's messy, but broadcast has to be updated. And the media ownership rules, that's insanity. We have analog media ownership rules in old media, and then we have new media that has no rules. And so, Netflix is international, YouTube is global, Yahoo is global, and they don't have any limits about where they can reach or what they can own or whatever. And that's where the innovation is occurring, which Adam has talked about. So without question, the Telecom Act with legacy Title II, but the legacy cable monopoly stuff is horrible and distorting. And then the broadcast, it's just fiction. It needs to be updated, and the broadcasters have a lot of valuable content, a very important role in the marketplace, but it needs to have a digital modern model, and the law needs to allow it to evolve to that.
Okay, well, we are going to have to wrap up here because I don't want to violate any of the Senate rules, but we're going to do it. I'm trying to make a historic deal with John Bergmayer right here before your eyes. We'll see what happens. Because this net neutrality issue has been around for 10 years now, really. That's when it started, at least 10 years. It's going on. It probably may go on for another 10 years, but the FCC is wrestling with it now. And you're all familiar with it, so I'm going to dispense with the background. But John, I think, favors Title II classification of broadband providers, right?
Yes.
And you've heard all the reasons here this morning why that's not a good idea, right? You may not agree with them, but you've heard.
I've heard the explanation.
My position is that because of a lot of things that Senator Thune said and others, that we ought to not do anything to adopt new rules, and that we ought to defer to Congress and just watch the marketplace. If there's a real market failure, certain harm, then the FCC can do something. So that's at the other end of the spectrum. But here's what I want to see whether we can do. Since I don't think the Commission's going to do Title II, and you probably don't, you think the Commission's going to do something. Would you support the Commission acting under 706 rather than Title II if the Commission were to adopt the same types of rules that it did in Selco? We're not going to go in that Selco decision. Commercial reasonableness with the test and with the flexibility that was recognized there to reach individualized deals under the commercial reasonableness standard. Now, if I said that I would do that, if the Commission were to take that approach, would you support that type of approach?
I don't think
you
that
have to shake on it.
The commercial reasonableness test that was used in the data roaming order is, to my mind, not enough. It expressly, at least as the FCC has articulated in the past, allows exactly the kinds of deals and discrimination that I don't think ought to be allowed under the rules. And then if the FCC sort of changes the commercial reasonableness test and tries to issue it under Section 706, I fear that they would just run afoul of the DC Circuit's precedent. So the commercial reasonableness test and the Celco 706 stuff, I mean, we're crossing between policy and law here, but I don't think that that's quite enough. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to decline your offer.
Okay, well, you saw me try, and we'll just have to continue the discussion. I'm sure we will. Please join me. This was a really good discussion following Senator Thune and Commissioner Pai. So join me in thanking John, Scott, and Adam.